I am very happy that you could join us for this fifth reading of Madame Bovary. Now, let's see where we left off. Okay, here we are. Very well. Part 2, Chapter 5. It was a Sunday in February, an afternoon when the snow was falling. They had all, Monsieur and Madame Bovary, Homais and Monsieur Léon, gone to see a yarn mill that was being built in the valley 1.5 miles from Yonville. The druggist had taken Napoleon and Athalie to give them some exercise, and Justin accompanied them, carrying the umbrellas on his shoulder. Nothing, however, could be less curious than this curiosity. A great piece of waste ground on which, pell-mell, amid a mass of sand and stones, were a few brake wheels, already rusty, surrounded by a quadrangular building pierced by a number of little windows. The building was unfinished, and the sky could be seen through the joists of the roofing. Attached to the top plank of the gable, a bunch of straw mixed with corn ears fluttered its tricolor ribbons in the wind. Homais was talking. He explained to the company the future importance of this establishment, computed the strength of the floorings, the thickness of the walls, and regretted extremely not having a yardstick such as Monsieur Binet possessed for his own special use. Emma, who had taken his arm, bent lightly against his shoulder, and she looked at the sun's disk, shedding afar through the mist his pale splendor. She turned. Charles was there. His cap was drawn down over his eyebrows, and his 2 thick lips were trembling, which added a look of stupidity to his face. His very back, his calm back, was irritating to behold, and she saw written upon his coat all the platitude of the bearer. While she was considering him thus, tasting in her irritation a sort of depraved pleasure, Léon made a step forward. The cold that made him pale seemed to add a more gentle languor to his face. Between his cravat and his neck, the somewhat loose collar of his shirt showed the skin. The lobe of his ear looked out from beneath a lock of hair, and his large blue eyes, raised to the clouds, seemed to Emma more limpid and more beautiful than those mountain lakes where the heavens are mirrored. "Wretched boy!" suddenly cried the chemist, and he ran to his son, who had just precipitated himself into a heap of lime in order to whiten his boots. At the reproaches with which he was being overwhelmed, Napoleon began to roar, while Justin dried his shoes with a wisp of straw. But a knife was wanted. Charles offered his. "Ah," she said to herself, "he carried a knife in his pocket like a peasant." The hoar frost was falling, and they turned back to Yonville. In the evening, Madame Bovary did not go to her neighbors, and when Charles had left and she felt herself alone, the comparison re-began with the clearness of a sensation almost actual, and with that lengthening of perspective which memory gives to things. Looking from her bed at the clean fire that was burning, she still saw, as she had down there, Léon standing up with one hand behind his cane, and with the other holding Athalie, who was quietly sucking a piece of ice. She thought him charming. She could not tear herself away from him, She recalled his other attitudes on other days, the words he had spoken, the sound of his voice, his whole person, and she repeated, pouting out her lips as if for a kiss. Yes, charming, charming. Is he not in love? She asked herself. But with whom? With me? All the proofs arose before her at once. Her heart leapt. The flame of the fire threw a joyous light upon the ceiling. She turned on her back, stretching out her arms. Then began the eternal lamentation. Oh, if heaven had not willed it! And why not? What prevented it? When Charles came home at midnight, she seemed to have just awakened, and as he made a noise undressing, she complained of a headache, then asked carelessly what had happened that evening. Monsieur Lyon, he said, went to his room early. She could not help smiling, and she fell asleep, her soul filled with a new delight. The next day, at dusk, she received a visit from Monsieur Leurier, the draper. He was a man of ability, was this shopkeeper. Born a Gascon, but bred a Norman, he grafted upon his southern volubility the cunning of the Cauchois. His fat, flabby, beardless face seemed dyed by a decoction of licorice, and his white hair made even more vivid the keen brilliance of his small black eyes. No one knew what he had been formerly. A peddler, said one, a banker at Routot, according to others. What was certain was that he made complex calculations in his head that would have frightened Binet himself. Polite to obsequiousness, he always held himself with his back bent in the position of one who bows or who invites. After leaving at the door, his hat surrounded with crape, he put down a green bandbox on the table and began by complaining to Madame, with many civilities, that he should have remained till that day without gaining her confidence. A poor shop like his was not made to attract a fashionable lady. He emphasized the words, yet she had only to command, and he would undertake to provide her with anything she might wish, either in her haberdashery or linen, millinery or fancy goods, for he went to town regularly 4 times a month. He was connected with the best houses. You could speak of him at the Trois Frères, at the Barbe d'Or, or the Grand Sauvage. All these gentlemen knew him as well as the insides of their pockets. Today, then, he had come to show Madame, in passing, various articles he happened to have, thanks to the most rare opportunity. And he pulled out 6 embroidered collars from the box. Madame Bovary examined them. I do not require anything, she said. Then Monsieur Leurier delicately exhibited 3 Algerian scarves, several packets of English needles, a pair of straw slippers, and finally 4 egg cups in coconut wood, carved in open work by convicts. Then, with both hands on the table, his neck stretched out, his figure bent forward, open-mouthed, he watched Emma look, who was walking up and down undecided amid these goods. From time to time, as if to remove some dust, he filliped with his nail the silk of the scarves spread out at full length, and they rustled with a little noise, making in the green twilight the gold spangles of the tissue scintillate like little stars. How much are they? Oh, a mere nothing, he replied. A mere nothing. But there's no hurry. Whenever it's convenient. She reflected for a few moments, and ended by again declining Monsieur Leurier's offer. He replied quite unconcernedly, "Very well. We shall understand one another by and by. I have always got on with ladies, if I didn't with my own." Emma smiled. "I wanted to tell you," he went on good-naturedly after his joke, "that it isn't the money I should trouble about. Why, I could give you some if need be." She made a gesture of surprise. Said he quickly and in a low voice. "I shouldn't have to go far to find you some. Rely on that." And he began asking after Pierre Tellier, the proprietor of the Café Français, whom Monsieur Bovary was then attending. "What's the matter with Pierre Tellier? He coughs so that he shakes his whole house, and I'm afraid he'll soon want a deal covering rather than a flannel vest. He was such a rake as a young man. Those sort of people, madame, have not the least regularity. He's burned up with brandy. Still, it's sad, all the same, to see an acquaintance go off." And while he fastened up his box, he discoursed about the doctor's patients. "It's the weather, no doubt," he said, looking frowningly at the floor, "that causes these illnesses. I too don't feel the thing. One of these days I shall even have to consult a doctor for a pain I have in my back. Well, goodbye, Madame Bovary. At your service, your very humble servant." And he closed the door gently. Emma had her dinner served in her bedroom, on a tray by the fireside. She was a long time over it. Everything was well with her. "How good I was," she said to herself, thinking of the scarves. She heard some steps on the stairs. It was Léon. She got up and took from the chest of drawers the first pile of dusters to be hemmed. When he came in, she seemed very busy. The conversation languished. Madame Bovary gave it up every few minutes, whilst he himself seemed quite embarrassed. Seated on a low chair near the fire, he turned round in his fingers the ivory thimble case. She stitched on, or, from time to time, turned down the hem of the cloth with her nail. She did not speak. He was silent, captivated by her silence as he would have been by her speech. Poor fellow, she thought. How have I displeased her? He asked himself. At last, however, Léon said that he should have, one of these days, to go to Rouen on some office business. "Your music subscription is out. Am I to renew it?" "No," she replied. "Why?" "Because," and pursing her lips, she slowly drew a long stitch of grey thread. This work irritated Léon. It seemed to roughen the ends of her fingers. A gallant phrase came into his head, but he did not risk it. "Then you are giving it up?" he went on. "What?" she asked hurriedly. "Music? Ah, yes. Have I not my house to look after, my husband to attend to? 1,000 things, in fact, many duties that must be considered first." She looked at the clock. Charles was late. Then she affected anxiety. 2 or 3 times she even repeated, "He is so good." The clerk was fond of Monsieur Bovary, but this tenderness on his behalf astonished him unpleasantly. Nevertheless, he took up on his praises, which he said everyone was singing, especially the chemist. "Ah, he is a good fellow," continued Emma. "Certainly," replied the clerk, and he began talking of Madame Homais, whose very untidy appearance generally made them laugh. "What does it matter?" interrupted Emma. "A good housewife does not trouble about her appearance." Then she relapsed into silence. It was the same on the following days. Her talks, her manners, everything changed. She took interest in the housework, went to church regularly, and looked after her servant with more severity. She took Berthe from nurse. When visitors called, Félicité brought her in, and Madame Bovary undressed her to show off her limbs. She declared she adored children. This was her consolation, her joy, her passion, and she accompanied her caresses with lyrical outbursts, which would have reminded anyone but the Yonville people of Sachette in Notre-Dame de Paris. When Charles came home, he found his slippers put to warm near the fire. His waistcoat now never wanted lining, nor his shirt buttons, and it was quite a pleasure to see in the cupboard the nightcaps arranged in piles of the same height. She no longer grumbled as formerly at taking a turn in the garden. What he proposed was always done, although she did not understand the wishes to which she submitted without a murmur, and when Léon saw him by his fireside after dinner, his 2 hands on his stomach, his 2 feet on the fender, his 2 cheeks red with feeding, his eyes moist with happiness, the child crawling along the carpet, and this woman with the slender waist who came behind his armchair to kiss his forehead. What madness, he said to himself, and how to reach her? And thus she seemed so virtuous and inaccessible to him that he lost all hope, even the faintest. But by this renunciation he placed her on an extraordinary pinnacle. To him she stood outside those fleshly attributes from which he had nothing to obtain, and in his heart she rose ever, and became farther removed from him after the magnificent manner of an apotheosis that is taking wing. It was one of those pure feelings that do not interfere with life, that are cultivated because they are rare, and whose loss would afflict more than their passion rejoices. Emma grew thinner, her cheeks paler, her face longer. With her black hair, her large eyes, her aquiline nose, her bird-like walk, and all was silent now, did she not seem to be passing through life scarcely touching it, and to bear on her brow the vague impress of some divine destiny. She was so sad and so calm, at once so gentle and so reserved, that near her one felt oneself seized by an icy charm, as we shudder in churches at the perfume of the flowers mingling with the cold of the marble. The others even did not escape from this seduction. The chemist said, "She is a woman of great parts. Who wouldn't be misplaced in a sub-prefecture?" The housewives admired her economy, the patients her politeness, the poor her charity. But she was eaten up with desires, with rage, with hate. That dress with the narrow folds hid a distracted fear, of whose torment those chaste lips said nothing. She was in love with Léon, and sought solitude that she might, with the more ease, delight in his image. The sight of his form troubled the voluptuousness of this mediation. Emma thrilled at the sound of his step. Then, in his presence, the emotion subsided, and afterwards there remained to her only an immense astonishment that ended in sorrow. Léon did not know that when he left her in despair, she rose after he had gone to see him in the street. She concerned herself about his comings and goings. She invented quite a history to find an excuse for going to his room. The chemist's wife seemed happy to her to sleep under the same roof, and her thoughts constantly centered upon this house, like the Lion d'Or pigeons who came there to dip their red feet and white wings in its goddess. But the more Emma recognized her love, the more she crushed it down, that it might not be evident, that she might make it less. She would have liked Léon to guess it, and she imagined chances, catastrophes that should facilitate this. What restrained her was, no doubt, idleness and fear, and a sense of shame also. She thought she had repulsed him too much, that the time was past, that all was lost. Then pride and joy of being able to say to herself, "I am virtuous," and to look at herself in the glass, taking resigned poses, consoled her a little for the sacrifice she believed she was making. Then the lust of the flesh, the longing for money, and the melancholy of passion all blended themselves into one suffering. And instead of turning her thoughts from it, she clave to it the more, urging herself to pain, and seeking everywhere occasion for it. She was irritated by an ill-served dish or by a half-open door, bewailed the velvet she had not, the happiness she had missed, her too exalted dreams, her narrow home. What exasperated her was that Charles did not seem to notice her anguish. His conviction that he was making her happy seemed to her an imbecile insult, and his sureness on this point ingratitude. For whose sake, then, was she virtuous? Was it not for him, the obstacle to all felicity, the cause of all misery, and, as it were, the sharp clasp of that complex strap that bucked her in on all sides? On him alone, then, she concentrated all the various hatreds that resulted from her boredom, and every effort to diminish only augmented it, for this useless trouble was added to the other reasons for despair, and contributed still more to the separation between them. Her own gentleness to herself made her rebel against him. Domestic mediocrity drove her to lewd fancies, marriage tenderness to adulterous desires. She would have liked Charles to beat her, that she might have a better right to hate him, to revenge herself upon him. She was surprised sometimes at the atrocious conjectures that came into her thoughts, and she had to go on smiling, to hear repeated to her at all hours that she was happy, to pretend to be happy, to let it be believed. Yet she had loathing of this hypocrisy. She was seized with the temptation to flee somewhere with Léon, to try a new life. But at once a vague chasm full of darkness opened within her soul. Besides, he no longer loves me, she thought. What is to become of me? What help is to be hoped for? What consolation? What solace? She was left broken, breathless, inert, sobbing in a low voice with flowing tears. "Why don't you tell master?" the servant asked her when she came in during these crises. "It is the nerves," said Emma. "Do not speak to him of it. It would worry him." "Ah, yes," Félicité went on. "You are just like La Guérine, Pierre Guérine's daughter, the fisherman of Paulet that I used to know at Dieppe before I came to you." She was so sad to see her standing upright on the threshold of her house. She seemed to you like a winding sheet spread out before the door. Her illness, it appears, was a kind of fog that she had in her head, and the doctors could not do anything, nor the priest either. When she was taken too bad, she went off quite alone to the seashore, so that the customs officer, going his rounds, often found her lying flat on her face, crying on the shingle. Then, after her marriage, it went off, they say. But with me, replied Emma, it was after marriage that it began. Part 2, Chapter 6. One evening, when the window was open, and she, sitting by it, had been watching Les Boudoir, the beetle, trimming the box, she suddenly heard the Angelus ringing. It was the beginning of April, when the primroses are in bloom, and the warm wind blows over the flower beds newly turned, and the gardens, like women, seem to be getting ready for the summer fete. Through the bars of the arbor, and away beyond the river seen in the fields, meandering through the grass in wandering curves, the evening vapors rose between the leafless poplars, touching their outlines with a violet tint, paler and more transparent than a subtle gauze caught athwart their branches. In the distance, cattle moved about. Neither their steps nor their lowing could be heard, and the bell, still ringing through the air, kept up its peaceful lamentation. With this repeated tinkling, the thoughts of the young woman lost themselves in old memories of her youth and school days. She remembered the great candlesticks that rose above the vases full of flowers on the altar, and the tabernacle with its small columns. She would have liked to be once more lost in the long line of white veils, marked off here and there by the stuffed black hoods of the good sisters bending over their prie-dieu. At Mass on Sundays, when she looked up, she saw the gentle face of the Virgin, amid the blue smoke of the rising incense. Then she was moved. She felt herself weak and quite deserted, like the down of a bird whirled by the tempest. And it was unconsciously that she went towards the church, included to no matter what devotions, so that her soul was absorbed and all existence lost in it. On the Place, she met Les Boudoir on his way back, for in order not to shorten his day's labor, he preferred interrupting his work, then beginning it again, so that he rang the Angelus to suit his own convenience. Besides, the ringing over a little earlier warned the lads of catechism hour. Already, a few who had arrived were playing marbles on the stones of the cemetery. Others, astride the wall, swung their legs, kicking with their clogs the large nettles growing between the little enclosures and the newest graves. This was the only green spot. All the rest was but stones, always covered with a fine powder, despite the vestry broom. The children in list shoes ran about there as if it were an enclosure made for them. The shouts of their voices could be heard through the humming of the bell. This grew less and less with the swinging of the great rope that, hanging from the top of the belfry, dragged its end on the ground. Swallows flitted to and fro, uttering little cries, cut the air with the edge of their wings, and swiftly returned to their yellow nests under the tiles of the coping. At the end of the church, a lamp was burning. The wick of a nightlight in a glass hung up. Its light from a distance looked like a white stain trembling in the oil. A long ray of the sun fell across the nave and seemed to darken the lower sides and the corners. "Where is the curé?" asked Madame Bovary of one of the lads, who was amusing himself by shaking a swivel in a hole too large for it. He's just coming," he answered. And in fact, the door of the presbytery grated. A Bernardine appeared. The children, pell-mell, fled into the church. "These young scamps," murmured the priest, "always the same." Then, picking up a catechism, all in rags, that he had struck with his foot. They respect nothing. But as soon as he caught sight of Madame Bovary, "Oh, excuse me," he said, "I did not recognize you." He thrust the catechism into his pocket and stopped short, balancing the heavy vestry key between his two fingers. The light of the setting sun that fell full upon his face paled the lasting of his cassock, shiny at the elbows, unraveled at the hem. Grease and tobacco stains followed along his broad chest, the lines of the buttons, and grew more numerous the further they were from his neckcloth, in which the massive folds of his red chin rested. This was dotted with yellow spots that disappeared beneath the coarse hair of his greyish beard. He had just dined and was breathing noisily. "How are you?" he added. "Not well," replied Emma. "I am ill." "Well, and so am I," answered the priest. "These first warm days weaken one most remarkably, don't they? But after all, we are born to suffer, as St. Paul says. But what does Monsieur Bovary think of it?" "He," she said with a gesture of contempt. "What," replied the good fellow, quite astonished, "doesn't he prescribe something for you?" "Ah," said Emma, "it is no earthly remedy I need." But the curé, from time to time, looked into the church where the kneeling boys were shouldering one another and tumbling over like packs of cards. "I should like to know," she went on. "You look out, Riboudet," cried the priest in an angry voice. "I'll warm your ears, you imp." Then turning to Emma, "He's Boudet, the carpenter's son. His parents are well off, and let him do just as he pleases. Yet he could learn quickly if he would, for he is very sharp. And so sometimes for a joke I call him Riboudet, like the road one takes to go to Marom. And I even say, Mon Riboudet, haha, Mon Riboudet. The other day I repeated that just to Monseigneur, and he laughed at it. He condescended to laugh at it. And how is Monsieur Bovary?" She seemed not to hear him, and he went on, always very busy, no doubt, for he and I are certainly the busiest people in the parish. But he is doctor of the body, he added with a thick laugh, and I of the soul. She fixed her pleading eyes upon the priest. "Yes," she said, "you solace all sorrows." "Ah, don't talk to me of it, Madame Bovary. This morning I had to go to Bad Yoville for a cow that was ill. They thought it was under a spell. All their cows. I don't know how it is, but pardon me. Longuemare and Boudet, bless me. Will you leave off?" And with a bound he ran into the church. The boys were just then clustering around the large desk, climbing over the precentor's footstool, opening the missal, and others on tiptoe were just about to venture into the confessional. But the priest suddenly distributed a shower of cuffs among them, seizing them by the collars of their coats. He lifted them from the ground and deposited them on their knees on the stone of the choir, firmly, as if he meant planting them there. "Yes," said he, when he returned to Emma, unfolding his large cotton handkerchief, one corner of which he put between his teeth. "Farmers are much to be pitied." "Others, too," she replied. "Assuredly, town laborers, for example. Is not they? Oh, pardon. I've there known poor mothers of families, virtuous women, I assure you, real saints, who wanted even bread." "But those," replied Emma, and the corners of her mouth twitched as she spoke, "those, Monsieur le Curé, who have bread and have no—" "Fire in the winter," said the priest. "Oh, what does that matter?" What does it matter? It seems to me that when one has fire and food, for, after all, my God, she sighed. It is indigestion, no doubt. You must get home, Madame Bovary. Drink a little tea, that will strengthen you, or else a glass of fresh water with a little moist sugar. Why? And she looked like one awakening from a dream. Well, you see, you were putting your hand to your forehead. I thought you felt faint. Then, bethinking himself, but you were asking me something. What is it? I really don't remember. Nothing, repeated Emma. And the glance she cast around her slowly fell upon the old man in the cassock. They looked at one another, face to face, without speaking. Then, Madame Bovary, he said at last, excuse me, but duty first. You know, I must look after my good-for-nothings. The first communion will soon be upon us, and I fear we shall be behind after all. So, after Ascension Day, I keep them recta, an extra hour every Wednesday. Poor children. One cannot lead them too soon into the path of the Lord, as moreover he has himself recommended us to do by the mouth of his divine Son. Good health to you, Madame. My respects to your husband. And he went into the church, making a genuflection as soon as he reached the door. Emma saw him disappear between the double row of forms, walking with a heavy tread, his head a little bent over his shoulder, and with his two hands half open behind him. Then she turned on her heel, all of one piece, like a statue on a pivot, and went homewards. But the loud voice of the priest, the clear voices of the boys still reached her ears and went on behind her. Are you a Christian? Yes, I am a Christian. What is a Christian? He who, being baptized. She went up to the steps of the staircase holding on to the banisters, and when she was in her room, threw herself into an armchair. The whitish light of the window panes fell with soft undulations. The furniture in its place seemed to have become more immobile and to lose itself in the shadow as in an ocean of darkness. The fire was out. The clock went on ticking, and Emma vaguely marveled at this calm of all things, while within herself was such tumult. But little Berthe was there, between the window and the work table, tottering on her knitted shoes, and trying to come to her mother to catch hold of the ends of her apron strings. Leave me alone, said the latter, putting her from her with her hand. The little girl soon came up closer against her knees, and leaned on them with her arms. She looked up with her large blue eyes, while a small thread of pure saliva dribbled from her lips onto the silk apron. Leave me alone, repeated the young woman quite irritably. Her face frightened the child, who began to scream. Will you leave me alone? She said, pushing her with her elbow. Berthe fell at the foot of the drawers against the brass handle, cutting her cheek, which began to bleed against it. Madame Bovary sprang to lift her up, broke the bell rope, called for the servant with all her might, and she was just going to curse herself when Charles appeared. It was the dinner hour. He had come home. Look, dear, said Emma in a calm voice. The little one fell down while she was playing and has hurt herself. Charles reassured her the case was not a serious one, and he went for some sticking plaster. Madame Bovary did not go downstairs to the dining room. She wished to remain alone to look after the child. Then, watching her sleep, the little anxiety she felt gradually wore off, and she seemed very stupid to herself, and very good to have been so worried just now at so little. Berthe, in fact, no longer sobbed. Her breathing now imperceptibly raised the cotton covering. Big tears lay in the corner of the half-closed eyelids, through whose lashes one could see two pale sunken pupils. The plaster stuck on her cheek drew the skin obliquely. It is very strange, thought Emma, how ugly this child is. When at 11 o'clock Charles came back from the chemist's shop, whither he had gone after dinner to return the remainder of the sticking plaster, he found his wife standing by the cradle. "I assure you it's nothing," he said, kissing her on the forehead. "Don't worry, my poor darling, you will make yourself ill." He had stayed a long time at the chemist's. Although he had not seemed much moved, Homais nevertheless had exerted himself to buoy him up, to keep up his spirits. Then they had talked of the various dangers that threatened childhood, of the carelessness of servants. Madame Homais knew something of it, having still upon her chest the marks left by a basin full of soup that a cook had formerly dropped on her pinafore, and her good parents took no end of trouble for her. The knives were not sharpened, nor the floors waxed. There were iron gratings to the windows and strong bars across the fireplace. The little Homais, in spite of their spirit, could not stir without someone watching them. At the slightest cold, their father stuffed them with pectorals, and until they were turned 4, they all, without pity, had to wear wadded head protectors. This, it is true, was a fancy of Madame Homais. Her husband was inwardly afflicted at it, fearing the possible consequences of such compression to the intellectual organs. He even went so far as to say to her, "Do you want to make harps and bodecudos of them?" Charles, however, had several times tried to interrupt the conversation. "I should like to speak to you," he had whispered to the clerk's ear, who went upstairs in front of him. Can he suspect anything? Leon asked himself. His heart beat, and he racked his brain with surmises. At last, Charles, having shut the door, asked him to see himself what would be the price at Rouen of a fine daguerreotype. It was a sentimental surprise he intended for his wife. A delicate attention, his portrait in a frock coat. But he wanted first to know how much it would be. The inquiries would not put Monsieur Léon out, since he went to town almost every week. Why? Monsieur Homais suspected some young man's affair at the bottom of it, an intrigue. But he was mistaken. Léon was after no love-making. He was sadder than ever, as Madame Lefrançois saw from the amount of food he left on his plate. To find out more about it, she questioned the tax collector. Binet answered roughly that he wasn't paid by the police. All the same, his companion seemed very strange to him, for Léon often threw himself back in his chair and, stretching out his arms, complained vaguely of life. "It's because you don't take enough recreation," said the collector. "What recreation? If I were you, I'd have a laugh." "But I don't know how to turn," answered the clerk. "Ah, that's true," said the other, rubbing his chin with an air of mingled contempt and satisfaction. Léon was weary of loving without any result. Moreover, he was beginning to feel that depression caused by the repetition of the same kind of life, when no interest inspires and no hope sustains it. He was so bored with Yonville and its inhabitants that the sight of certain persons, of certain houses, irritated him beyond endurance. And the chemist, good fellow though he was becoming absolutely unbearable to him. Yet the prospect of a new condition of life frightened as much as it seduced him. This apprehension soon changed into impatience, and then Paris, from afar, sounded its fanfare of masked balls with the laugh of gazettes. As he was to finish reading there, why not set out at once? What prevented him? And he began making home preparations. He arranged his occupations beforehand. He furnished in his head an apartment. He would lead an artist's life there. He would take lessons on the guitar. He would have a dressing gown, a mask cap, blue velvet slippers. He even already was admiring 2 crossed foils over his chimney-piece, with a death's head on the guitar above them. The difficulty was the consent of his mother. Nothing, however, seemed more reasonable. Even his employer advised him to go to some other chambers where he could advance more rapidly. Taking a middle course, then, Léon looked for some place as second clerk at Rouen, found none, and at last wrote his mother a long letter full of details in which he set forth the reasons for going to live at Paris immediately. She consented. He did not hurry. Every day for a month Yvette carried boxes, valises, parcels for him from Yonville to Rouen, and from Rouen to Yonville. And when Léon had packed up his wardrobe, had his 3 armchairs restuffed, bought a stock of neckties, in a word, had made more preparations than for a voyage around the world, he put it off from week to week, until he received a second letter from his mother, urging him to leave, since he wanted to pass his examination before the vacation. When the moment for the farewells had come, Madame Homais wept. Justin sobbed. Homais, as a man of nerve, concealed his emotion. He wished to carry his friend's overcoat himself as far as the gate of the notary, who was taking Léon to Rouen in his carriage. The latter had just time to bid farewell to Monsieur Bovary. When he reached the head of the stairs, he stopped. He was so out of breath. As he came in, Madame Bovary arose hurriedly. "It is I again," said Léon. "I was sure of it." She bit her lips, and a rush of blood flowed under her skin, made her red from the roots of her hair to the top of her collar. She remained standing, leaning with her shoulders against the wainscot. "The doctor's not here?" he went on. "He's out," she repeated. "He's out." Then there was silence. They looked at one another, and their thoughts, confounded in the same agony, clung close together like 2 throbbing breasts. "I should like to kiss Berthe," said Léon. Emma went down a few steps and called Félicité. He threw one long look around him that took in the walls, the decorations, the fireplace, as if to penetrate everything, carry away everything. But she returned, and the servant brought Berthe, who was swinging a windmill roof downwards at the end of a string. Léon kissed her several times on the neck. "Goodbye, poor child. Goodbye, dear little one. Goodbye." And he gave her back to her mother. "Take her away," she said. They remained alone. Madame Bovary, her back turned, her face pressed against the window pane. Léon, his cap in his hand, knocking it softly against his thigh. "It is going to rain," said Emma. "I have a cloak," he answered. "Ah." She turned around, her chin lowered, her forehead bent forward. The light fell on it as on a piece of marble, to the curve of the eyebrows, without once being able to guess what Emma was seeing on the horizon, or what she was thinking within herself. "Well, goodbye," he sighed. She raised her head with a quick movement. "Yes, goodbye. Go." They advanced towards each other. He held out his hand. She hesitated. "In the English fashion, then," she said, giving her own hand wholly to him and forcing a laugh. Léon felt it between his fingers, and the very essence of all his being seemed to pass down into that moist palm. Then he opened his hand. Their eyes met again, and he disappeared. When he reached the marketplace, he stopped and hid behind a pillar to look for the last time at this white house with the 4 green blinds. He thought he saw a shadow behind the window in the room, but the curtain, sliding along the pole as though no one were touching it, slowly opened its long oblique folds that spread out with a single movement, and thus hung straight and motionless as a plaster wall. Léon set off running. From afar, he saw his employer's gig in the road, and by it a man in a coarse apron holding the horse. Homais and Monsieur Guillaumin were talking. They were waiting for him. "Embrace me," said the druggist with tears in his eyes. "Here's your coat, my good friend. Mind the cold. Take care of yourself. Look after yourself." "Come, Léon, jump in," said the notary. Homais bent over the splashboard and, in a voice broken by sobs, uttered these 3 sad words. "A pleasant journey." "Good night," said Monsieur Guillaumin. "Give him his head." They set out, and Homais went back. Madame Bovary had opened her window overlooking the garden and watched the clouds. They gathered around the sunset on the side of Rouen and then swiftly rolled back, their black columns, behind which the great rays of the sun looked out like the golden arrows of a suspended trophy, while the rest of the empty heavens was white as porcelain. But a gust of wind bowed the poplars, and suddenly the rain fell. It pattered against the green leaves. Then the sun reappeared, the hens clucked, sparrows shook their wings in the damp thickets, and the pools of water on the gravel, as they flowed away, carried off the pink flowers of an acacia. Ah, how far off he must be already, she thought. Monsieur Homais, as usual, came at 6:30 during dinner. "Well," said he, "so we've sent off our young friend." "So it seems," replied the doctor, then turning on his chair. "Any news at home?" Nothing much. Only my wife was a little moved this afternoon. You know women, and nothing upsets them, especially my wife. And we should be wrong to object to that, since their nervous organization is much more malleable than ours. "Ah, poor Léon," said Charles. "How will he live in Paris? Will he get used to it?" Madame Bovary sighed. "Get along," said the chemist, smacking his lips. "The outings at restaurants, the masked balls, the champagne, all that will be jolly enough, I assure you." "I don't think he'll go wrong," objected Bovary. "Nor do I," said Monsieur Homais quickly, "although he'll have to do like the rest for fear of passing for a Jesuit. And you don't know what a life those dogs lead in the Latin Quarter with actresses. Besides, students are thought a great deal of in Paris, provided they have a few accomplishments. They are received in the best society. There are even ladies of the Faubourg Saint-Germain who fall in love with them, which subsequently furnishes them opportunities for making very good matches." "But," said the doctor, "I fear for him that down there You're right, interrupted the chemist. That is the reverse of the medal. And one is constantly obliged to keep one's hand in one's pocket there. Thus, we will suppose you are in a public garden. An individual presents himself, well-dressed, even wearing an order, and whom one would take for a diplomatist. He approaches you, he insults himself, offers you a pinch of snuff, or picks up your hat. Then you become more intimate. He takes you to a cafe, invites you to his country house, introduces you, between two drinks, to all sorts of people. And 3/4 of the time it's only to plunder your watch or lead you into some pernicious step. That is true, said Charles. But I was thinking especially of illnesses, of typhoid fever, for example, that attack students from the provinces. Emma shuddered. Because of the change of regime, continued the chemist, and of the perturbation that results therefrom in the whole system. And then the water at Paris, don't you know? The dishes at restaurants, all the spiced food, end by heating the blood, and are not worth, whatever people may say of them, a good soup. For my own part, I have always preferred plain living. It is more healthy. So when I was studying pharmacy at Rouen, I boarded in a boarding house. I dined with the professors. And thus he went on, expounding his opinions generally and his personal likings, until Justin came to fetch him for a mulled egg that was wanted. Not a moment's peace, he cried. Always at it. I can't go out for a minute. Like a plough horse, I have always to be moiling and toiling. What drudgery. Then, when he was at the door, by the way, do you know the news? What news? That it is very likely, Homais went on, raising his eyebrows and assuming one of his most serious expressions, that the agricultural meeting of the Seine-Inférieure will be held this year at Yonville-l'Abbaye. The rumor, at all events, is going the round. This morning the paper alluded to it. It would be of the utmost importance for our district. But we'll talk it over later on. I can see, thank you, Justin has the lantern.